And so that begins with the 911 system on February 14th and the current 911 system in Parkland. It has all the Parkland 911 calls from cellular phones routed to Coral Springs. Hinders a swift and effective police response by BSO. All Parkland 911 callers from cell phones who need police assistance have to explain their emergency to Coral Springs, who then tells the person to stand by while Coral Springs calls Broward County Regional Communications. The Coral Springs dispatcher then tells the BSO dispatcher that they have a caller on the line with a police emergency, and the 911 caller repeats the reason for needing the police call over again to the BSO dispatcher. Anybody have anything on that one? It's a lot, but that's what the system is.
Can we talk about the amount of time it takes for all that to happen? Do you think that would be an important point to emphasize?
Let's read the rest of it. Going over to slide 95. In many instances, the original 911 caller hangs up before being transferred to BSO by Coral Springs, and this hinders the BSO dispatcher because they are unable to speak directly with the caller needing police help in Parkland. It also creates an officer safety issue for Parkland deputies because they cannot obtain updated information while responding to the emergency because the caller hung up and the dispatcher cannot reestablish contact with the caller. Many callers also become frustrated because they have to explain their emergency a second time and they do not understand the necessity of the redundancy. This call transfer system prohibits BSO from receiving direct 911 calls from its service area in Parkland and creates a situation, as it did on February 14th, where there is an information void adversely affecting an effective law enforcement response. You know, it's hard to say, Mr. Schachter, it's hard to provide a specific time in there. It certainly does delay it. I think what we know is what they said is the average time it takes. It adds about 30 seconds. That's an average, but.
I mean, you spelled it out perfectly in our testimonies at the BB&T Center, how it took this amount of seconds for this to happen, this amount of seconds for this to happen. Well, to really emphasize the point.
That is in the report. I mean, that's all in here. Okay. This is the findings. So we don't need to make this any longer than what it is.
People need to understand how much time it really takes, and those facts are important. People are not going to read the 450 pages. They're just going to read the findings and the recommendations, and to frame everything that all of these loved ones were killed in the shooting took over 4 minutes, but it took a minute and a half or 2 minutes or whatever the number was for the call transfer to get through. It needs to be emphasized strongly to get people to understand why this needs to be changed.
I believe if we made a statement that the convoluted 911 system delayed emergency responses to saving people, to the opportunity to save people's lives, that's important.
Okay.
Can we, and this is in support of what Commissioner Schachter is saying, I do think it's important to note here that most of these incidents, because we've said this over and over, most active shooting, it's very quick. And the first time this was effectively communicated over the 911 system was at this time. Well, by that time, there were already many casualties. And that is an important, that time frame is so critical, not just to the convoluted 911, it also relates back to everything we talked about needing an immediate response, because if folks are relying on the 911 system, it isn't it, because by the time the actual 911 call was made, you already had X number of casualties in place. And so
we could add in there, you could add in there on 95, after that paragraph, because it says in there, that where there's an information void adversely affecting the law enforcement response. We could put something in there is that specifically, comma, because of this system, on February 14, 2018, it took, and this is the number, it took 69 seconds before the first law enforcement officer was dispatched. And we work it out, but at that point, crews had already shot and killed X number of people on the first floor. You want to add something like that?
Yes.
And the reason that's important is because of the key fob hardening recommendation I made, and the fact that it takes so long for a 911 call to even get through in these mass emergencies. That key fob depression in 2 seconds, law enforcement knows. Here it took 69 seconds, and 24 people were already shot and killed by then. Sheriff, what were the numbers at that point in time?
21.
What's that?
With 69 seconds, how many people were shot and killed?
Probably, at that point, probably 22.
That needs to be in the report to get people to understand why the immediate notification is so critically important to saving lives.
All right, I got a note on it. We'll work it out. We'll
Thank
work out
you.
the language and put it in there and include that.
And maybe back to Commissioner Carroll's point, we need to make, as a matter of findings, maybe the beginning sentence. When the 911 call is made, the active shooter is already on campus, was already on campus killing innocent people. And, you know, responding to a 911 call is not the initial solution, because that gives credibility to all the other stuff.
But he's talking about we're in the 911 section now. We're talking about radio stuff. I mean, his point is going to the key fob thing.
I'm just saying,
Well,
this is all painting the picture to get people to change, and
I think the 911 system was convoluted and cost us time. But is it appropriate here to say the 911 system is not the initial answer?
But that's what with that key fob thing you're talking about. That key fob thing, if I understand it, what you're saying is that it automatically calls 911.
yeah, you hit the button,
Right.
and law enforcement is notified.
But
The
that
emergency.
doesn't. How does it transmit, Mr. Schachter? It transmits by cellular. The key
I
fob.
mean, I don't know the answer to that question,
Probably, right? And so if the protocol, it doesn't matter. So my point is, it ain't going to matter, because when you push a key fob and it transmits by cellular, if the program, if everything goes to Coral Springs,
it's not a phone call. It's a signal to law enforcement that there's an emergency in that school, and there's a GPS attached to the key fob.
okay,
They know
well,
exactly where the
we're in the
emergency
weeds
is.
on the key fob thing, but then it depends upon where that gets routed to, and I would assume and hope that
Route to BSO.
it would go to BSO. You would hope.
Yeah.
You know.
It still has to go through that system.
I don't know. I don't think we know that.
But my point for adding the detail is there are some, everything is in context, right? So if you said, well, it took a minute for this to happen, there are some folks who would say, well, a minute is not that long. But if you put it in context that in situations like this, a minute means that you already have 22 shot or killed folks in place. But that 1 minute means a whole lot of different things.
No, it's a big deal, and we've been stressing that, you know, all along. So we'll make sure we include that in there, and we'll talk about what this process created that day. It was an initial period of time, about 30 seconds, from the time that Coral Springs received it until Coral Springs transferred it, and then it was about another 42 seconds from the time the BSO call taker got it until the BSO call taker then gave it to the dispatcher, and then the dispatcher got on the radio. When you put all that together, it's right around 69 seconds. So the first time, from the time the first call came in, 911, the kid in the classroom, the very first one, until somebody put voice to radio and told a cop about it, was 69 seconds. And at that point, he's pretty much done on the first floor. That's the point. All right, so we'll include that in there. The next one in number 2, the system is designed for Coral Springs to transfer all 911 law enforcement calls it receives from Parkland to BSO. On February 14th, Coral Springs transferred very few calls it received, and this resulted in BSO as the primary response law enforcement agency not knowing all the information. You got a typo there, not knowing all the information. No, that's fine. Not knowing all the information known to Coral Springs, and this hindered BSO's response. Anything on that one? Number 3, on February 14th, the Coral Springs 911 Communications Center treated the Stoneman Douglas shooting solely as a fire EMS event because it provides those services to Parkland, not police. Coral Springs waited 4 minutes and 22 seconds from the time it received the first call of shots fired until it dispatched the first Coral Springs officer. Coral Springs could not effect a quicker response by BSO because it had to transfer the call to BSO, and Coral Springs could not communicate directly via radio with BSO Parkland deputies. We could put in there, Commissioner Carroll, if you want, and we can put some context for that, because at 4 minutes and 22 seconds, he was in the third floor teacher. All the shooting was done at that point.
It was over, yeah.
That's a good idea. I like that.
We can put that. We can put some context in there with that.
Sheriff, I was going to suggest when you talked about that timeline, and you said, here's when it was received, here's what happens.
Right.
If you'll put one more column to show how many were shot at each of those second intervals, then it closes the loop on what Commissioner Carroll said, that when you took only 30 seconds, well, this many people were shot at that time. So if that at some point in time was in here, I think that would give the visual of how seconds matter. Does that work?
No, absolutely.
All right, we'll try and do something like that. We'll see what we can do there.
I still think that other than medical care and the delay that was caused because of communication in that regard, the only person that arrived on scene with the capability of doing anything to mitigate the number of people shot and killed was Peterson. And, I mean, that's going to show on the timeline as well.
And I agree with that, but the part I disagree with is only because he elected not to go into classrooms. Because if he elected to continue expending the 180 rounds he had left and he had gone into classrooms, he could have spent much more time in that school, and the delayed response could have made this a lot worse if he had acted differently.
I think it'll give startling reality when we list the seconds of the 911 call and what the active shooter did during that same period of time. I think.
Because most people are not going to spend the time to understand the whole picture here. They're just going to read this, and we need to paint the picture in the findings as best we can so people understand.
Okay, so let's go over to, so we got it. We're going to try and beef that up with some of what is consistent with what we're talking about. So we'll see what we can do in that regard to add that. Number 4, the decision to route all Parkland calls that originate from cell phones to Coral Springs and not Broward Regional Communications was made by the city of Parkland. The transfer process delayed the law enforcement response to Stoneman Douglas on February 14th. The city of Parkland has the authority to decide where its 911 calls are routed, and the city can change that routing process at will.
I think it's worth noting, and people are going to ask by reading this, why would they do that? I think we should also include the reason they did that was because 80 or 90% of the calls that come into 911 are medical calls for medical service.
I mean, that's what they say. You know, you want to get into? Do you want to get in? I mean, that you know is.
That's what I mean. Those are the facts. I mean,
well, you know, that decision was made. I don't know. Do you all want to get into that? I mean, to me, it sounds like you're defending the decision.
okay.
You know, if you want to defend the decision, then that's the will of the commission, then we can do that. I don't think that. You know, I think you know where I am on it. Parkland needs to change that, and you know, but it's a bad system. But
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I'm just, if people are going to read this and say, why would they do that?
I hope they read it and ask, why would you do that? Because it's a bad system. That's
I
what
think
they
we need
should
to
ask.
answer that question that people are going to have when they read this.
What's that?
I think we need to answer that question when they read this, and if we added a little bit of context, it would answer that question. I certainly don't want to give them a pass, but that is the answer to that question.
I just want to say I respectfully disagree with Commissioner Schachter. I think the city of Parkland needs to answer that question, not this commission.
Yeah, let them answer it.
Okay.
Let them defend it if that's what they want to do. I don't think it's a good policy and a good process, and they're the ones that are solely in the position to change it, and they should change it.
And I'm certainly not defending that at all. I agree with you.
I have a question. I'm hoping someone can refresh my memory. My recollection is that landline 911 calls go to BSO,
Right.
which is another complication
Well,
in this. And what I do not remember at all is why. Is there something about landlines that can't be routed?
So back in the day when all this was decided, is that the majority of 911 calls were landline calls and not cellular calls. And so what they decided is that since most of the calls were coming from landlines on this, that they would set it up that way. And now it's changed, and that the majority of calls now are cellular calls. So that was the rationale that was stated to us, and that what we've been told and what we have read. That was the rationale behind it when that decision was made many years ago. But of course, the landscape has changed now. But to your point, and to answer it and to provide the clarity, is the same thing holds true in reverse. If you get somebody that's sitting in their living room on a Sunday afternoon and starts having a heart attack, and they pick up their landline phone and they need paramedics right now, is that they're going to get connected to the Broward County Regional Communications Center. They're going to say, what's your emergency? The person's going to say, I'm having a heart attack and I need EMS, etc. That Broward County Regional Communications person is going to say, hold on, stand by, and they're going to pick up the phone and they're going to call over to Coral Springs. Coral Springs is then going to go through the process, and the person's going to have to repeat it all over again to Coral Springs. So that bifurcated process works both ways. If you are calling from a cell phone in Parkland and you need the police, you go to Coral Springs and then you get transferred, you tell your story again, and there's a delay. If you need EMS and you call from a cell phone, you get right to Parkland and they're going to dispatch you. But if you need EMS or fire and you're calling from a landline, hardline phone, then it's going to go the reverse. It's going to go to Broward, then Broward's going to transfer you to Coral Springs, and then Coral Springs is going to begin EMD, emergency medical dispatch, and go through their process. So you got to delay. The problem works both ways.
And I did read that we have a recommendation regarding 911 call centers that I think will address it in both directions.
There is one in there, yeah.
So,
So it says here, and this is what we know, is BSO brought the Parkland 911 call workflow issue to the city of Parkland in 2014, but there have been no discussions resulting in a resolution since that time.
I don't think that's 100% accurate.
Okay.
There have been a lot of discussions on resolving this since February 14th.
What do you want?
As far as the call transfers, there is the issue that would resolve this is the CAD, is if Coral Springs is on the same CAD, and
That doesn't resolve it. I got a letter. I haven't read it. I got a letter from the city manager a couple of days ago. The CAD, having a CAD, and I glanced at it, is something about that. Having the same CAD still doesn't allow you to talk to the caller. They can still put it. So I don't know. The CAD does not resolve this issue.
I was told by the chief of the Coral Springs Fire Department that it does.
Well, I don't really
Yes.
care what he says.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
telling you that it still results in a call tree. Is that they get it and they put it into the CAD. CAD's digital. Voice is voice. It's two different things. So anyway, we can change that if you want to say BSO brought this issue to the. Are we going to eliminate it? I don't care.
They don't need to transfer it because everything's entered into the CAD, and then Coral Springs can see it. So they don't need to transfer it to Coral Springs to get all the information. It's already in the CAD.
That would require self-dispatching.
What are you talking about, Mr. Schachter?
If the caller calls in to BSO, they enter everything into the CAD, Coral Springs sees it.
But they still can't talk to the caller. I'm talking about in law enforcement calls. If a law enforcement call from somebody in Parkland says, I need the police, then it goes into Coral Springs, and Coral Springs has the BSO CAD, and that Coral Springs call taker is entering it digitally and is going into the CAD system. They still not talking to the BSO deputy. So when the BSO deputy says, what's the description of the robber? What's the description of the guy in the backyard? What's happening? Where's the guy with a knife? That person who's entering in digitally still is not talking to the deputies, because the only person talking to the deputies are the people over at Regional Communications. There's still not direct communication between the caller and the person in the communication center who is directly communicating with responding law enforcement. You still don't have that. And that is imperative for an officer safety and for an effective law enforcement response.
If the call comes in and it goes to BSO, the person that's taking the call is interrogating the caller and asking these questions and typing it into the CAD. And then if it's initially it would go to Coral Springs. If a cell phone call comes in, it'd go to Coral Springs. The Coral Springs dispatcher would interrogate the call, types it into the CAD, and then if it's fire, obviously Coral Springs. If it's BSO, then it's dispatched, and they can see everything because it's in the same CAD.
But they can't. You're missing it. Seeing it and seeing what somebody's putting in is not the same thing as being able to communicate it over the radio. And for that deputy to be able to say to the dispatcher and have live, real-time communication. There's a huge difference.
It's a different agency responding.
Huge difference, correct. Because they still don't have the ability in the Coral Springs Communication Center to have radio communications with the Parkland deputies who are responding. That's the way a law enforcement response works. When you're responding to an in-progress call, is you're not sitting there looking at the CAD and seeing what people are, is that you're getting a shots fired call, and where's the shooter, what's the description of the shooter, all that's being put out over the radio, and that person who's entering all this stuff in the CAD isn't communicating with the deputies or responding because they can't communicate with them. It does not solve the problem. Go ahead.
One of the things that we don't have here is any reference to the 911 calls from the school, because I'm not clear if there ever were 911 calls made from landline.
No calls from the landlines that we know
So
about.
when we have safe school plans at all of our schools that identify incidents, they all, one of the top of the things on the list is to call 911. Now, I don't know, we did cover the staff response section in another chapter, and I don't know if we would want to put it in there, but I think there would have to be something to reference that, because you can't assume that if you have a law enforcement officer on a campus of any size that there's not more information that could be shared through a 911 call, that the officer would know everything. So my concern is, would it be a place here to put a finding that there were no 911 calls made from the landline at the school? No one took responsibility for notifying.
We can put a statement to that effect. I want to make sure that, Andy, do you know, I don't know of any. Do you know of any? No. So we can put a statement in there. We can make a finding in there that there were no 911 calls, no known 911 calls received from any hardline or landline phones at Stoneman Douglas. Is that what, we'll put that in there?
Yes.
Okay. We'll just find the right place to put that in there. Okay, I got it. We'll make sure we put it in there, Commissioner.
Chair,
Yeah.
I do think it's factually incorrect to state that no discussions have been taking place. That's what this.
We can resolve. So BSO brought the Parkland 911 workflow issue to the city of Parkland in 2014, but there has not been a resolution since that time.
I'm good with that.
Okay, we'll just change it to that. Okay. Number 1 on 98. Coral Springs and BSO have independent CAD systems, so officers and deputies cannot see each other's calls in addition to not being able to hear each other's calls on the radio. There is no electronic data sharing of CAD data between Coral Springs and BSO. Number two, there are no known substantive issues regarding the actual entries made into the CADs on February 14th, other than they couldn't see each other. So there was no problems with what was entered in the limited data. That's just what we're getting at there. Anybody have anything with 1 or 2? Then going over to 99, number 3, the initial CAD entry into the Coral Springs Fire Department computer-aided dispatch and not the Coral Springs Police Department computer-aided dispatch delayed the law enforcement response. Remember, they treated it as a fire event, and they're putting all the stuff in the fire CAD, and they didn't put anything in the police CAD. So different law enforcement agencies using different CAD systems within the same county creates information silos and barriers to sharing emergency information, as well as delaying response to emergency calls. Anybody have anything? Yes, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I remember. With number 3, doing that that's not the right way, right?
Well, it actually was consistent with the protocols and the policies that were in place, because the Coral Springs Communication Center, and I said this, they actually handled it correctly within the framework that was set up, because what they had been trained to do in their policies and their protocols for Coral Springs to treat it as solely as a fire EMS event, because they weren't responsible for law enforcement. And so they got on the radio and they notified the fire department, and then they started making these fire department CAD entries. So they're actually putting in the fire department CAD that there's a shooting at MSD, that there's casualties, et cetera. So they're starting to put that stuff in. So they actually followed what the protocol was that was set up.
And just that is true. However, is it also correct that law enforcement has to go out first before fire can go? So,
in something like that, the fire EMS is not going to go in until law enforcement says the scene is clear, and they're going to do what's called staging, and they're going to get to a certain point at some distance, and they're going to stage and stay until they receive authority, if you will, or clearance, probably a better word, from law enforcement that they should go in. So while they're putting all this out and dispatching fire, and you heard some of the dispatchers from Coral Springs say that, well, we're going to stage and we're going to stage. That's because they're getting them going, and they're putting information out over the radio, and they're putting it in their fire CAD, but it's getting them to a holding pattern or a holding place. And as they're sitting there, they're going to keep holding as they're getting this information until law enforcement says it's safe to go in.
Well, were they simultaneously, they did simultaneously notify BSO, correct?
I think the first entries, the first call was, yes, it was transferred, and about that time is that they were also putting it out over the fire radio and the fire CAD. So yes, they were sending it over to BSO, and they were putting it over the fire radio and the fire CAD, and all that was happening together. But then they treated the whole thing as a fire event for those first 4 minutes and 21 seconds. Sheriff Ashley?
Can we put in 3 that the initial CAD entry in the Coral Springs Fire Department CAD and not the Coral Springs Police Department CAD significantly delayed the Coral Springs law enforcement response? I mean, it's 4 minutes and 46 seconds.
Significantly delayed.
And I would put, it significantly delayed Coral Springs response, because once they got it, they were there in 19 seconds.
But I thought you said that was protocol.
It
was, but it doesn't mean that it was good. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, it was, and you heard Chief Perry say is that he's now changed that in response to this, and he's made policy changes, procedure changes to rectify this so that it won't happen again. I mean, Chief was very straight up about it and accepting, and immediately once he found out about it, I know from talking to him, he was floored about that. But they've made changes on that.
I think it also needs to be noted that the calls that came in once, forget the terminology, their bank was filled,
right.
The calls, came back inside them as opposed to going to the other PSAP. That should be a finding as well.
So Coral Springs.
It went to their non-emergency line.
Well, it went to the EOC, which is the Emergency Operations Center, and those are not recorded. And then some came in on admin lines as well.
It should have gone to the other PSAP, which might have been much better.
I don't know how far do you all want to get into this. I mean, you're really, really, really down into the weeds of this. Anytime you have an incident like this, I don't know of any 911 communication centers capabilities that are not going to be exceeded if they are the center that's getting these.
And that's fine, but if they're exceeded, it's supposed to roll into the other PSAP, and it did not occur in this instance. If the other calls would have gone to the other PSAP, maybe other officers would have dispatched, maybe other information would have gotten to the right place. This was a mistake that they didn't know was going to happen.
You know, at Coral Springs.
Correct.
Right. I'm not sure exactly where to put that, Mr. Schachter. I don't know that it's, you know, we can look at it, I guess. We got so much here. You know, we had to pick and choose what we're putting in here.
Okay.
You know, I think we're getting a little below the water line on that.
Okay.
Because we got to get through this. So we finished with 3 and 4 on page 99. Now we're in 8.4. We're in the radio systems. Once we get through this, we'll break for lunch. We got to get through this chapter. So number 1 is that due to the independent communication systems of BSO and Coral Springs, the agencies don't share a radio channel. On February 14th, neither agency's patrol units had each other's radio channels in their portables. BSO dispatch did not have the Coral Springs radio channel in its dispatch console. Coral Springs recently authorized BSO to install the radio channel, and BSO Parkland deputies now have Coral Springs radio channels in their portable radios. Any concerns or additions, changes to number 1 on slide 100? Number 2, the lack of radio interoperability and the BSO throttling issue hampered the response and caused officer safety issues. The BSO system currently in use can only accept about 250 inbound requests per minute, whereas the new system will be implemented at the end of 2019 will have a higher capacity of about 750 per minute.
Here.
Yes.
Is that correct? Didn't they testify that it had now been pushed back even further? I thought there was something about now they were looking at 2021 or something to that effect.
Well, I'll look into it. You know, we'll make sure that's correct.
Why don't we just take the year out?
We can do that. The new system that will be implemented and take out, just take out at the end of 2019. Right. We can do that. All right, we'll just take it out. We'll have a much higher capacity. Okay, we'll do that. Let's go over to 51, page 51, slide 101. BSO and Coral Springs not being able to communicate on the same channel or through patch channels affected the law enforcement response, caused information voids and silos. The patch was attempted and it failed because BSO didn't have Coral Springs channel and BSO could not patch what it did not have. Go ahead.
Sheriff, and this might not be in this exact section, but I think it's important to point out that due to the throttling that, and also the inoperability that SWAT had to use hand signals, I think that visualization is an important one to...
Number 6, it's already there.
Is that in there? I'd like to say hand signals.
Yeah, when we get there,
okay.
Let's do it when we get there. So we're back on number 3. Anything else on number 3? Good. Number 4, while there existed common mutual aid channels that they could have used, there was inadequate common knowledge that those channels existed and the personnel weren't trained in how to access them. It would have been cumbersome and tactical issues and tactically unsound to go through the process of switching to the mutual aid channels. Anything with that one? Number 5, slide 102, the lack of capacity caused radio throttling during BSO's response and resulted in deputies and command staff not being able to transmit on their radios. That throttling also hampered effective command and control. Getting to this all together. And number 6, SWAT could not effectively communicate via radio and had to use cell phones, runners, and hand signals to communicate in person due to the radio failures. So I'll add that there, Mr. Schachter.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
The throttling, we've defined what that is somewhere in here, haven't we?
It's in the report. I mean, it's in there. We talk about it.
We know what it is. I was just not sure the reading.
Yeah, and I'll make sure it's all running together now, but I'm sure we did because you know, the short version is it's what's caused by exceeding radio capacity, but I'm sure it's in there.
213.
230. Okay.
213.
213. Okay.
But, you know, Sheriff Ashley's point is well taken that I think it's important that we should put a definition of that in the findings so that if people do not read the report, at least they'll understand what we're talking about.
You know, sometimes people just got to do what, you know, they got to take some responsibility and figure it out. You know, we can't spoon feed everything to everybody all the time. You're going to make this thing huge if we keep doing that.
Just a couple of sentences on what throttling is.
The same radio problems that happened during BSO's response to the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting in 2017. Over on 8, Coral Springs has expressed concern over the county's radio replacement plan and has no plans to join the regional communication system even when the new radio system is in place. Anything on that? And this gets to their point of their radios are equipped with GPS so that Coral Springs knows where their officers are precisely, and BSO does not have that technology, and their ability to know the precise location of the deputies is limited. Anything on that one?
I'm just trying to. Yeah, I mean, you know, we heard testimony that the Coral Springs radio is much better than the county's radio system. And that's one reason why they don't want to change over now. But you're talking about even when the new regional communication system is in place. So
that's what they're saying. They're not switching.
I think in the recommendations is where you say once the county has a system that's as good as Coral Springs, because the finding's accurate.
Well, the county system in that respect, and that's why I put number 9 in there, because the county system is not going to do what the Coral Springs system does as far as radio-equipped GPS, where they can pinpoint on GPS, as you're well aware, Sheriff Judd, where their officers are. The new county system is not going to have that capability, and that's one of the biggest reasons, as I understand it, that Coral Springs says is they're not going to switch, because there are no plans for the county system to have that capability.
So then that needs to be one of our recommendations that they do.
Well, you know, we can put it in there. It's already baked. I mean, they already said they're not doing it, and they already began implementation. But let's talk about recommendations. You want to put it in there? We can put it in there.
Yeah, I think we ought to put it in there.
We can put it in there.
I mean, I've got all my cars GPSed. I want to know where they are, and it's just.
It's cheap too. I mean,
well, they're not talking about
it's not the cars.
Be clear that they're not talking about the mobiles, and they're talking about the portables. So so that way they can actually pinpoint where the deputies are in their portables, and the new county system is not going to do that. They're not talking. BSO has GPS now
On the vehicles.
On the vehicles. What Coral Springs has is that on the portables.
Okay.
And that's what they're talking about.
Okay.
The new county system will not have it on the portables.
I think we need to make sure we understand that's mobile and not vehicles.
Do the other sheriffs on the commission have that capability?
Ours is on the mobiles.
Ours is on the vehicles. It's not on people.
Yeah,
I mean on the vehicles, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we do on the portables on these for all of our K-9 deputies, but not for everybody else. So CPS radio equipped with GPS, CPS. So I'm gonna add that, Sheriff Judd. It's a good point for clarification. CPSD portable radios are equipped with GPS so that Coral Springs knows the precise location of every officer. That's why it says officer, not car there. So I'll add that and make sure that that's clear in there on 103. All right, let's go over to recommendations. Slide 105. Law enforcement agencies should be required to have communications interoperability with all other law enforcement agencies in their county. The methodology for accomplishing this is immaterial, but the interoperability is essential. So again, we're saying you should have it. There's all kinds of ways to do it. We're not telling them how to do it, but it should be done. That's the recommendation. Does anybody have anything on that one? If an agency asks another for access to their radios, it should be mandated that the agency honor the request. Anybody have anything on that one?
I have a question about that one. Is that intended to be like a blanket request for all times, or is that intended to be for specific events or timeframes?
Well, my intention there that it's a blanket request. You have situations now where, and it's different from county to county, but you have some situations now, each agency, if you will, owns their own channels, and there are some that don't want others having their channels for some reason, and the people who operate the systems will not install one agency's radios in another agency's radios without the agency that owns it authorizing it, and some just don't authorize it. And so the suggestion there is that if people want to be that type of an obstructionist to effective interoperability, is that it should be mandated that if one police agency or law enforcement agency asks, that the other should be required to allow them access to it, because frankly, in my view, that's nothing other than they should be required to do it, because there's no good reason for not giving it.
So it's a blanket for all time going forward from that moment?
That's my suggestion.
Okay.
Was this put in there because one of these agencies rejected this?
Yeah, I mean, you had, and that's one of the problems. Yeah, is that was the problem. It probably goes back, and I don't know how far, but it certainly predated Chief Perry, because he wasn't BSO did not have the Coral Springs channel.
8 Alpha?
Correct. No, BSO did not have the Coral Springs channel in its dispatch console. You had on that day is that you had, now think about this, you had Parkland deputies in Parkland. They did not have the Coral Springs radio channel, but you had Coconut Creek officers that had the Coral Springs channel. So, and it goes back to, a lot of it is territorialism, infighting, nonsense, and no good, sound operational reason. It goes back to all the nonsense reasons.
Some of the reasonings that I've heard, and not that they're good reasonings, but the crowding of an exclusive service. We all share a service. The exclusive service of a lot of municipal radios, they don't want their channels to be crowded with additional personnel, which is certainly a case in throttling. The more people that get on that. So that's the reasoning. Albeit it's not a good reason, that is some of the reasoning.
But when nobody should be just hopping up on somebody else's channel. But when you have an event like this and a situation like this, of course, I think we'd all agree that interoperability is paramount, and they should have the capability of doing it. Go ahead.
And I understand the concept. I'm a little concerned over just the breadth of it. So just for example, for those of us in law enforcement, if I ask for your SWAT channel, I really have no need to have that information. And so from a regional, I don't know how we narrow that down, if you're a contemporary or a connected agency or in the same region or whatever, but the way that's written right now,
Point taken. What about if we say, if an agency asks another agency for access to their primary dispatch channels?
Primary dispatch or a reasonable requested channel, something like that. I wouldn't give it to my CID. I'm not going to give you CID channels. We know that in law enforcement, but the legislative group's not going to necessarily know that.
Well, I mean, I'm okay with saying primary dispatch. That certainly accomplishes what we're looking for. You guys go
okay with that?
You guys go with that? Primary dispatch. So if another agency asks for access to their primary dispatch radio channels. All right, law enforcement agencies are encouraged to tactically train their personnel so they're familiar with all radio functionality. That's pretty straightforward. Here's one that, I don't know, Florida law should require that all primary 911 call centers have the ability to directly communicate via radio with the first responder units for which they are receiving 911 calls. So that means that you can't have a situation that you have today, that if somebody calls the Coral Springs Communications Center from a cell phone in Parkland, that there is not a radio channel in that Parkland, that Coral Springs can come up on to communicate with the Parkland deputies. Is that if you're a 911 center and you're taking calls, is that from that communication center, you must be able to communicate via radio with fire, EMS, police that cover the service area that you're taking calls from.
I would just add without transfer.
Okay.
In the previous line too, we used the word encourage, and I would say should tactically train their personnel.
Okay,
Question on that, Sheriff, is the implication, is the logical result or implication of that the elimination of individual municipal PSAPs, the way that we're talking?
It doesn't have to. There's all kinds of different ways to do that. You don't have to. There's a number of ways to do this. And no, it does not mean, and I'm not encouraging that. So the answer is no. It doesn't eliminate 911 PSAPs. You could have a situation where if that PSAP now is taking 911 calls, they would have to transfer it over to the other agency. If they're taking a 911 call and somebody says, there's a shooting at Stoneman Douglas, that you got the radio channel for that primary responding agency, that you can get right up on that channel now and say, Parkland units, there's an active shooter at Stoneman Douglas, start heading there, and then you can transfer it over. But you have the ability to come up on the radio channel to get them going at that minute. That would take care of that without eliminating the municipal PSAP.
And I'm for unified,
Yeah.
regardless. No disrespect, chiefs, but I'm for unified centers. I just want to make sure that our intent is clear, so it's not read differently in other venues.
It could, and consolidation's a good thing, because I'm with you on that, and get as many people under one roof, and I think there's a lot of good, solid operational reasons for that. But realizing that that's not going to happen is there's other ways to accomplish this, which eliminates this void and the problem that we faced here. Yeah, go ahead.
Sheriff, this point is back to the throttling, but one thing that I don't think we mentioned was the fact that Broward County Schools has refused to take the non-essential personnel off of the radio channels. I'm talking about all the school buses, and this contributed to the throttling. At the same time, all the school buses are operating, and that's keying up the system. I think that contributed to the throttling. You want to mention that?
That's already in the works, and they're in the process of moving them off that. You know that.
No, I know, but that's a finding.
What's that going to do? What's that change? The system's overloaded. That's a given. Everybody knew that.
I agree, but you want to put that as a recommendation that
they're already in the process of doing that.
But I'm talking about the entire state and acknowledging that fact that those should be separated like they have in Miami to give guidance so this doesn't happen.
I don't know that it's happened anywhere else. Do you know of any other place where they got, buses that are overloading systems? I don't know of any other place. Do you?
I'm just saying Miami has them on separate systems, and that might be a recommendation moving forward.
Okay, let's just try and get through this for now. All public safety agencies should work toward consolidation of 911 call centers and eliminate the call transfer process. Anything with that one? The City of Parkland should require that the Broward County Regional Communications Center receive all cellular and landline 911 calls originating in the City of Parkland. So, what do you all have on that one?
I have a question on this one. Would this then, the flow for law enforcement here, I think, would work, but this would change the way Parkland residents access fire services, right?
Yeah, you're correct, Commissioner Petty. You're correct on that. Is that because then you would have you're correct.
Would this just reverse the problem?
Yeah.
So, and with 80 to 90% of the calls emanating from Parkland being medical response calls, that might not be a good thing.
Right? It's an issue. Well, you know, under the current system, it's, you know, either way, it's going to be a problem. We can take it out if y'all, you know, whatever the...
In my conversation with the chief of the fire department, he told me last night that if Coral Springs gets their own CAD and they're on the system, that will eliminate the problem. I understand you're saying that's not true, but...
Well, the CADs are one issue, but having the caller talk to the dispatcher directly is the other issue. And that, I don't know that the chief is contemplating that in his merging of the CAD systems, Mr. Schachter. That's the issue. This recommendation, though, concerns me because we're trading law enforcement response and fire response here, and that's what I'm concerned about.
Well, we're
I don't know which ones.
We can take it out if you want. You know, I mean, it's you know, whatever the group decision is.
What is? I mean, it goes without stating, I guess. It's suboptimal the way it's been put forward in Parkland, and we're either trading fire or
right.
We've got to get this solved as a city. We need the city of Parkland to get together with the county and Coral Springs and figure this out. We shouldn't be trading 911 law enforcement response for fire and medical. We shouldn't have to make that trade-off. And I don't know that the citizens of Parkland understood that we are in that situation, and I don't think we should be in that situation, and we need to fix it.
I know that Commissioner Michael Udine and all of the city and county officials are working extremely hard to fix this as we speak.
Yep.
I would recommend we strike this from our recommendations and let the parties and the stakeholders involved fix this. I think they're going to, and I know they understand the urgency.
I have a concern that as a commission, we have identified this as a specific issue that contributed to a delayed response. And it seems to me that we would be derelict if we don't address it in some way with some recommendation, because it is a finding. I mean, we even put the context in about how long it all took because it's set up the way it is. So I believe we have to address it with a recommendation, some sort of recommendation.
I think in light of bullet point 4 on slide 105, I think that does resolve the issue and address the concern. But I agree, you know, with Commissioner Schachter, Commissioner Petty regarding the language of that and just simply allowing the municipalities. But I do think that we do address that directly with that last bullet point on slide 105.
And I would recommend, just as we're doing with the superintendent and the sheriff, we bring these individuals back to make sure and put pressure on them that they do fix it.
Could our recommendation simply be what's already being done? We just simply recommend that the parties all get together and resolve this?
So what do you want to say? The cities of Parkland and Coral Springs, or the city of Parkland, should continue working to resolve the issue or something to that effect? Or?
I recommend that we strike that bullet point, and and move on.
All right. So is everybody okay? Anybody not okay? We'll just strike that one. So the one that says City of Parkland should require that BSO receive, we'll strike that. Unless anybody's not in agreement with. Okay. The next one: school districts and law enforcement agencies should strive for radio interoperability. All law enforcement agencies in Broward County and every county in Florida should operate on a single computer-aided dispatch system. What about that one? Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I would object to that, mostly because there are a lot of disparate systems, and particularly in Miami-Dade County. Just the city of Miami alone, their police department's 1,100 officers, which eclipses many sheriff's offices, and they're on the separate CAD system, an entirely separate functionality.
City
And
of
as long as you
Miami
have, City of Miami,
is different.
as long as you have radio interoperability, which we all know in law enforcement is the most important thing.
Yeah.
As I'm responding to a mass casualty, I'm not looking at the CAD, I'm listening to the radio.
So, I don't disagree. That's probably a reach. So unless anybody's got any issue, we can take that out. All right. So before we move into Chapter 9, I think we break for lunch. I know everybody wants to try and get out of here at a decent time today. I would suggest, unless it's a problem, that we only take 30 minutes for lunch when we come back. So I've got just about almost 12:40, so we'll start at 1:10 and begin with Chapter 9.